Mimeograph is really interested in our sense of reality, what it feels like to cling to an idea of reality that might not align with how others perceive reality. It is super fascinating, but I mean, to some extent, it is also troubling because at a certain point, you're just like, no, reality is what I say it is. And that can be a really hard starting point if you want to create policy or find an ideological common ground or things like that.
This is the future.
Hello and welcome to the Alternate Futures podcast, where we chat with indie sci-fi creators about their work, the world, and anything in between, or beyond. I'm your host, Edwin Rydberg, and today I'm here with Eira A Ekre. Eira is a Swedish writer and narrative designer who has worked in the game and tech industry since the early 2010s. She's narrative director of the studio Might and Delight, whose cozy adventure Twinklebee launched in September 2025 and is available on Steam, along with several other games from the studio. Her award-winning YA audio drama Klara Fardiga, I hope I didn't mangle that too badly, created with a Swedish civil contingencies agency, was named Podcast of the Year and distributed to teens across Sweden. Eira's work blends the fantastical with the everyday to explore identity, art, and technology. She writes in both English and Swedish and teaches narrative design nationwide. Eira, thanks for joining me today.
Thank you. Happy to be here.
So you are the second Swede I've had and the second video game developer as well, which is excellent. Both of them after David Poolfelt, who's the founder of the publishing house that you've published your story with, which we'll get into in a little while. But you're in Stockholm, is that correct?
Yes, I'm in Stockholm.
Because he was in Malmo. So I'm just wondering a Swedish perspective on, first of all, which one's better? And should I visit Stockholm as someone with Swedish ancestry?
You should definitely visit Stockholm. I mean, a caveat here is that I'm actually I'm born in Stockholm, grew up first couple of years down south in like the Malmö area where David is from. So I have that like really contentious negative view of the south that you have when it's like your childhood place. And then my boyfriend, he lived in Malmö for a long time, so I used to commute there a lot of the time, and as the train just arrived at Malmö station, I would just fill with rage progressively as I got closer and closer to the city because I'm just like, I mean, it's sort of like hating, a football team, but it's also like all of these sort of complex emotions that are tied to living in different places at different times of your life, that type of thing. So, I mean, I can be really mean about Malmö, but I can also see that it has some perks. Like you can easily just jump on a train and go to Denmark, and it's right by the sea, which I'm always a fan of the sea. But I mean, if you want to see, there are just a lot of main capital things that you can do in Stockholm that you can't really do in Malmö. So just for that type of touristy experience, I think I would recommend Stockholm more. But the actual place that I always recommend people to go if you go to Sweden is Gotland, which is sort of limestone island off the coast of Sweden. So it's about a 1 hour train ride from Stockholm, and then you jump on a ferry and you go to Gotland. And it has a lot of just ruins from medieval times. It has a lot of fossils. It has a lot of really cool, unique biomes. So it's a really cool place to spend time on, and just even if you just like travel by car for 15 minutes, you're going to be in a location that's just vastly different from the location you were previously in. So I would try to get that into your trip if you actually come here.
Yes, I'll have to schedule Sweden at some point. But it sounds like they say you can never go home again, but it sounds like maybe sometimes you don't want to go home again either. I kind of have similar feelings for my own town in the middle of nowhere, Canada, but we won't get into that. So you're also the second video game developer, whereas David managed a large AAA studio. You're on a smaller studio. And so, first of all, I guess, how did you get involved in that?
Well, I started working in video games when I was around 16 years old. So I've been doing this for, well, 16 years now. And I got this writing gig first as an intern and then just got hired as a game writer. And that was sort of I mean, not the first wave, I guess the second wave of these like growing game development studios in Stockholm. So I worked with several of the studios that are really, really big now during a time when they were quite small and just sort of picking up steam. And I figured I'm just going to stick around with this for as long as it seems like a profession you can do and get paid for. And then it just sort of kept happening, I guess. So I I worked as a game writer. I did a lot of scripting, a lot of just split things in development because, like, small studio, you wear a lot of hats, that type of thing. Over time, I mean, narrative design as a concept didn't really exist at that time. You were just sort of an abstract writer or content creator for a game, and you overlapped with a bunch of different roles. But, and I mean, the industry still has this problem, but it had it to an even larger extent back then, where you created a game and then you added the story, where it's just like, we have all of these set pieces, explain why they are connected. And that's not a great way to create an immersive, interactive, story driven experience. So that's how I ended up creating these narrative design courses that I've been teaching. And I've been teaching them both like tailor made for studios to just sort of get a writing team, you know, to be more tight knit and work better together. But I've also taught them more at just schools or in collaborations with museums, just for the general public, if they want to sort of get a taste for interactive storytelling and creating stories that aren't necessarily linear. So, yeah, I've been sort of dual wielding that for a long time. And actually, my role right now is managing director. So I'm not doing much narrative design. Where I'm currently at, I started out as a narrative director at this studio, but I'm I'm very much that kind of person where if things aren't working out on a sort of project management level, I'm really drawn to just trying to streamline things and just I prefer to support a team getting a project actually out there rather than sitting in my silo and just delivering, whatever my tasks are and hoping that the project will get released eventually. Because I think at least a third of the games I worked on during my career have just never been released. And that's just sort of part of the course when you're working in this industry.
Sounds like you kind of had one of a few possible common dream pathways out of high school. There's sort of working on video games, either coding or writing the story, or then there's video game tester or professional video game player, right? And you so you hit
Yeah.
the storytelling one. Do you ever then sort of as a manager, I don't want to phrase it this way necessarily, but get like a bit frustrated and want to take the reins from the people underneath you for the storytelling part of it?
Oh, absolutely. I mean, it's a constant challenge, I think, when you are fairly specialized within a field, but you're stepping back and because you don't want to micromanage. You want to build a team where you can trust that your team members are specialized enough in their areas that you can actually just, let them scope their own work. You can give them tasks and you can be very hands off with what they're doing. And then there's, of course, like quality control and just, because you're also creating a product that is the baseline for being able to pay out salaries. So you also need to check in and make sure that, the level of work that they're doing is good enough. But it can definitely be a struggle if there are things that you would do very differently that you can't really interfere with, at least not completely, because there is the sort of baseline quality level, but then there's more like, well, I can't take the reins from a designer and be like, I could do that better, because maybe I couldn't, but because of the power dynamics in that type of team, if you're in a high enough position, you can't really have an open creative discussion about it either. Because if the person who sets your salary comes into the room and says, I want to do it this way, would you dare to, confront them about that might not be the best idea. So there are so many social dynamics to keep in mind. And I mean, that's part of the reason that I have all my other creative projects outside of work, because then it's easier to let go of the things that we're doing like at work, where I can allow people to experiment and maybe not make the best decisions all the time, but they can learn from what they're trying out. And then I can spend my own time focusing on my stories and be really egocentric about it and be really just like narcissistic about all the choices I make for those stories.
So when you say narrative design, what does that mean for you? And especially coming because you are a prose writer. We're going to be talking about your story in a bit, but you also, I mean, obviously video game narratives are, as you said, interactive. And so there's a difference there. So how would you describe for the listener narrative design?
It's a great question, because the term, since it became more of a defined role within the industry, it's developed so much. So these days we have a bunch of categories within narrative design. We have titles like technical narrative designer that overlaps more with a programmer or a systems designer. There are people in the narrative design spectrum who are pretty much not technical at all, but who might write text in a Google sheet or an Excel sheet, and then that is imported into whatever game engine you're using. There's a bunch of in between stuff where you're a bit technical, but you also do a lot of hands on writing. For me, I approach it with a sort of overview type of perspective. I'm interested in the meta narrative design. I'm interested in how you're telling stories throughout every aspect of the game. So I'm not necessarily focused on writing dialogue or item descriptions, like the things that you sometimes boil down to narrative in games, which is, people will look at a game like, I don't know, Super Mario and say there isn't much narrative design here because there isn't that much dialogue. But to me, that isn't really true, because there's so much environmental storytelling, there's so much cohesion in the character designs, how like the relationships between the characters, all the work you're doing through the visual medium and the audio. And I think that's the tricky part with games. I've worked in a lot of different mediums, I've written audio dramas, etc. And over time, I felt that one important thing when approaching a story is to figure out what medium would serve it best, because we have so many video games out there that would be better movies or TV shows. They are just super cutscene heavy, they are linear, they don't really utilize the fact that the the player, the audience is inside of the story and is actively driving it forward through interacting with the world. But on the other hand, there are movies and books that would make fantastic video games, because you can see how a lot of their themes would be enhanced by interactive elements, or being able to, immerse someone in those experiences. So that's genuinely a thing I ask myself when I have ideas, where I'm like, what medium should I tell this story in? Is it audio based? Like, what would enhance it and, communicate it in the best possible way to an audience? And as a baseline, I really like just literature. I like writing just books in my free time. But I've been leaning more and more to doing audio projects and just smaller, like Twine, like sort of smaller game project, just to explore more with different mediums, basically.
So one thing I was curious because we mentioned Twinkleby, I think that's how you pronounce it,
Yeah.
in the bio, and I played the demo of it. So how would you describe the narrative design within that? Because it's basically it appears to be essentially a decorating slash collecting style game.
I would say there isn't much. Like I barely had any design input on that. So I mostly just helped clean things up along the way. With the game like Twinkleby, the places where you could do a lot of narrative work, for example, is things like, okay, so there is this system where you build small neighborhoods, and then different types of characters come and move in. These characters are attracted to different features. So, based on their personalities, they are interested in specific items or things to do within your neighborhoods. So one challenge in the game is to figure out the characters with more particular interests, how you can attract them and get them to move in. So that's part of the collection that's going on in the game. And then part of the sort of, I guess, narrative work, but this overlaps with a lot of other design choices as well, obviously, is how do you name the characters? Like, how do you create consistent naming conventions that tie into the different functions that these characters have? Because they might overlap in different ways, they might have conflicting interests. So there are just small things like that you can do to enhance the world building, but then to also communicate game features. I mean, I'm going to sound like so just old and clanking down on modern game design, but I'm so in love with older games that are good at communicating things without tutorials, without having giant blobs of text popping up and explaining what you're supposed to do, where you're more like onboarded into the scene where you see things happen and over time realize how you can interact with the world and you can observe your surroundings and learn from that. So so there's a lot of that type of work that you can do with a game like Twinklebee, where it's just like how understanding how the player would perceive things in the game and play into that and just enhance how easily and intuitively they can, progress through different things.
I think everyone kind of feels that bloat on the tutorial side. It's a bit of sort of onboarding slash interface design issues, it would seem. And again, probably falls in the narrative design category as well.
Yeah, I mean, sort of. And I think it's because there are just these areas where we've gotten lazy, I think, on the when it comes to video games, where, back in the day, you had to keep game sizes really, really small because there just wasn't that much available space on any given platform for someone to install a game. But now we just have an abundance of space for games. So people release games that are huge. And even Twinklebee, we've looked at and been like, this could have been smaller. Like, we might look into doing a version where it just takes up less space because we should be able to optimize it more. And recently I saw that, for example, I think it's Helldivers 2 that did a release where the update is that the game is 85% smaller now because they've just optimized it so much. And similarly, we've gotten a bit lazy with things like using achievements and tutorials to guide people through an environment in a medium that back in the day was really focused on immersion and the fact that you're just like slowly immersed in a world that you understand through interaction. And now we can just like add achievements that pop up every time you do a thing correctly in the game, or we can just trigger tutorials whenever. And then there's an over reliance on that rather than spending an extra month on doing good game design. And I mean, it's also the question of like, because there are games where you look at them and you're just like, okay, but with all of the effort that went into this, like it looks so shiny, it plays at such a high FPS, like look at all these tech specs. And then you might be able to rationalize it more in your head, even though I don't think it's ever justified for games to take up that much space because we can make them smaller. It's just a question of cutting production time and being lazy to some extent.
So if you could, thinking from narrative design perspective and your video game experience, what would be your ideal game that you would like to see made?
I mean, if I could just do whatever I wanted, I actually have a few sort of game ideas in the pipeline that are either ideas that friends or acquaintances have that I think would be really interested to work with. I'm really into the soundscape element of games, and I feel that's quite often undervalued. Just being part of different game development teams and seeing how much time or budget they allocate for audio in comparison to other parts of the game, it's just like, well, no, I mean, the game needs to have sound. Like, you do understand that everything you do in the game needs to be represented in the audio environment. So I think it would be really fun to lean really heavily into that. One of my sort of current dream projects is to have something where you could collaborate both with several musicians to create a really rich like soundtrack, work with a lot of motifs, but also to work with audio designers and have that both the soundtrack and the sort of audio environments are tightly tied to the gameplay. So that is something that we are actually in early stages with that, with just like a sort of side project. So hopefully that's something that I can come back and talk more about. But then I also have a friend who's done a tremendous work just doing a lot of historical research and doing a new translation of an old Swedish, like Old Norse text. And we have spent probably a year trying to figure out how to make a book out of it. Like he has thousands of pages of just re-examining words and their origins and looking at, basically cave paintings and rune stones and just reimagining stuff to a point where you can't really do that in academia because it's a lot of assumption. So it's very much of a literary work, but it's like, how do we present it and all of the research and all of the different layers where you can have three different interpretations of a certain word and how all of those are interconnected. And the more I've thought about it, the more it feels like a game, the more it feels like someone should be able to navigate all of this and just be able to sort of see if that they can construct the text themselves and see how different translation choices basically translates to a different final text. So there are a bunch of those types of more esoteric projects that I would really much want to make in the future. And then there are, of course, more, I don't know, mainstream projects that would also be fun to make. Like there are so many IPs out there, a lot of worlds that would really lend themselves to fun interactive stories. So yeah, I'm always hyped to just see which which creators are interested in sort of branching off to games, because there are a lot of potential of just, being able to place people in an engaging world that already exists.
So many games to make in so little time.
Yeah.
Something that I was just sort of trigger a thought when you mentioned about the audio, because I think I've been hearing recently discussions on writing for people with dyslexia, for example. Do you find there might be ways to approach video game design, whether it's audio, whether it's visual, whether it's narrative design, that would be more interactive, more beneficial for people, let's say neurodivergent people like dyslexics and things like that?
Definitely. Because I've been teaching narrative design a lot at just schools for different age brackets, but I guess it's always hard to translate Swedish grades to other countries because we just have sort of different age spans. But so say around, I have done elementary school, but say around more like high school-ish, I guess. And so usually use a tool called Twine for this. It's an open source narrative tool. You can use it in a browser, so you don't even need to download it. And you can find it at, I think the website is like twinery.org. And so Twine is basically a text-based tool to easily create branching storylines. So the base function is you start out with a little box, you can write the text there, and then you can connect it to multiple boxes where the story branches. And one thing that we've noticed when I've been around to different schools and I've taught kids how to use this is that kids that would normally have issues to just write a single page of text will just sit down for a couple of hours and write really sprawling stories where the teachers are like, they never do this. Like it's an amazing amount of text that they suddenly put down without even complaining about it. And I have friends who either have dyslexia or they have ADHD, and a lot of them specifically feel that Twine, it just activates something in their brain when they use it, where it's easier to just have a flow state of writing. There's just something about it being in these like tiny chunks where you can just click between them and you build it throughout all of these squares rather than having a giant document in front of you that is really intuitive to them. So I think that also quite easily translates to being able to, engage with the story or engage with complex themes might also be easier when it's broken up in a similar way where you sort of through interaction progress through a story. And there's this site called Itch.io where indie devs can put up their projects. It's similar to Steam, but you can put things up for free. It can be a sort of pay whatever you want type of thing. And there's really no sort of threshold for how big a project needs to be. You can put up a game project on Itch.io that's like 10 minutes long or something like that. And I've been following several creators that have used Twine or similar text tools to create interactive essays. So there's a creator called Space Twinks, and he's done a lot of like really long, sprawling essays on things like Marvel's history of comic book publishing and why their sales plummeted around this specific era. And you basically have this really intricate essay structure of like, here is the sort of higher analysis. Here you can deep dive into different areas that you feel are interesting. So it's like falling into a Wikipedia hole, but it's way more like designed to guide you through all of the information. So I think there's a lot of potential if you apply these types of tools in the right way, because I have worked for a while. I worked outside of the game industry, and one of the places I worked was educational publishing house that were looking into digitizing a lot of material and just how do we create digital courses because that's where education is moving. But they don't work with these types of designers. They don't work with these types of tools. It's more about like, how do we translate a textbook to a digital book? And that's the end of it. And that sort of depresses me because I feel like these types of tools could actually have the potential to reach students that are currently aren't being, or aren't connecting with the material that we currently have.
Yeah, no, I agree. I feel it's quite depressing in some ways. I feel like the schools are a bit lazy in this. And they
Yeah.
had such good opportunities, in the early stages of COVID, the first couple of years as well, to sort of really explore this. My daughter's school, she's nearing the end of high school now, but literally they more or less just translate the course
Yeah.
onto computer access. And many times they don't even do that. They'll just like wait until they can sort of jointly record it with the class or something. It's just
And
messed
it's
up.
because it's also all of these studies that come out that just point towards that a lot of kids learn better with at least some analog elements. Like the ideal structure would be to incorporate both and try to create multimedia courses. But then it's either a hard pivot to digital or it's clinging to what we had before. And it's such a shame that there isn't really an overlap between all of the sort of digital tools that are used both in game development and similar industries where they could really enhance the tools that we have in schools. It's depressing.
Yeah, it's interesting because there has been quite a lot of research done on this. I mean, I took a course, it's over 10 years ago, I think now. And so you can imagine in that time it's advanced even further. And yet it's simply not being implemented in schools at all. They just seem sort of really stuck on the old model. And
Yeah.
there's so much they could be doing. And it's almost like if you wanted to create a system that made it as difficult to learn as possible, you'd use the current system, right?
Yeah,
It's
exactly.
it's just frustrating. So moving in a slightly different direction, you did a podcast as well for it. I mean, you could explain that. So the mangled Swedish that I described it in, it translates as ready, set. Is that correct?
So it's literally the Swedish version of that. So in Swedish it would be klara, färdiga, and then gå, and in English it's ready, set, go.
Ready, set, go.
So it's and that it was this effort by the Swedish contingency agency to create a sort of educational audio drama. So they wanted a story that is created as sort of any story targeting kids around 15, 16 years old, and that is relatable to them, but they wanted it centered around like an event that could also set up for educational like actions by the characters. And it was really interesting because I think they approached it in a really, really good way where they definitely were leaning to the side of we need the characters to be believable. Like these characters need to feel like believable 16-year-olds. Like their references for how to solve different situations needs to be things like I saw this on TV, or like I in this movie they try to like, you know, staple a wound shut or whatever. Should we try that? Where they can get into conversations about things like that. And half the time, the characters are allowed to just fuck up and don't solve things in a good manner, because after each audio episode, we have this sort of Q&A where they talk about the things that happened and things you can do instead. So it was a really fun project. Like they were really good to work with. I feel like they approached it in a very good, realistic way, because otherwise, if it was just, you know, it needs to be educational, so everyone needs to know what they're doing so they can teach kids to do the right thing. It's like that's not going to be an engaging story, because suddenly you have a bunch of unrealistic characters who just do the right thing all of the time. Like that's not an interesting story. So I spent time with them just mapping out what type of scenario would be a good setting and what they are interested in teaching kids, basically. So the foundation of the story is that there is some type of bigger electrical outage that affects like big parts of a city and neighboring areas, and that in turn leads to like banks being affected as well. So you can't like easily use digital services to pay for things and stuff like that. So it becomes this domino effect of characters being spread out and either just being stuck on a train for a really long time, or like trying to get home from a place that's like really far away from home, just like fairly simple situations like that where it still requires them to, you know, speak to strangers or collaborate, or like getting into conflicts and trying to resolve them, and just finding a good level of drama where it doesn't feel like, oh, this is like scare propaganda, like you should be frightened of the future, etc. But just like, okay, but what's like a fairly ordinary thing that could happen that could severely impact your day-to-day life for a couple of days, and how do you handle that? And I think we have a character who gets locked out of a smart house, etc. Just a bunch of those domino effects from a fairly ordinary event. And it was really fun to write. Like they were, like I said, they were good collaboration partners, and I got a lot of freedom in how to construct the story. So
Excellent. And did you have any hand in the actual recording of the podcast at all?
no, not much. So I got to, because I wrote the original drafts, and then the recording studio did a pass, like a fairly big pass on the script. But I got a final feedback round of just if there were changes they'd made where I felt like it affected the sort of intention of a scene or that type of thing. The tricky thing with working, because I have worked with exactly this podcast production company on the other side, where I was one of the people who rewrote the scripts. And when you rewrite the scripts, you get more money the more changes you make. So that was kind of tricky being on the other side of it and knowing that like there's basically another me on the other side that have done a lot of changes because they just want to double their paycheck, where I'm like, I get it, but some of these changes just like really negatively impacts the story. Because I mean, this was like a paid gig. They're just buying the text from me. It's not like it's my name on top of all of the send outs to like 200,000 kids. So it's like this is the Swedish contingency story. So you don't want to be too ego about it and just like, but my vision. So I had to take a step back and think about it more from a, I guess, PR perspective, where I'm like, there were some changes. I'm like, this could be fairly challenging PR wise. Like the way you're changing this character feels like it's moving towards a stereotype, and I'm not sure you want that. So those types of things were easy to correct. And then there were other things where I'm like, I'm leaving it. Like, it's not my story, like it's yours. So
Right, getting that balance. Yeah. So, yeah, stereotypes are something that the companies tend to fall into quite easily, aren't they?
yeah.
So yeah. So at what point did you start writing science fiction sort of independent of the video game side of things then?
I've done it for a long time. Like about 15 years ago, I was part of founding this podcast called Fruktan, which is basically is the Swedish word for fear. So we did a lot of horror short stories, and we were quite early, as a podcast and also as audio stories on Spotify and stuff. So we had a couple of years where we were quite big in Sweden and we had quite a lot of listeners, and we published a couple of short story collections together. But my horror has always leaned more towards the esoteric and more sci-fi-ish. It's always very existential and fairly stripped down. So even the stories I wrote for those two short story collections are quite sci-fi adjacent, at least. And I think that, I mean, because I like most genre literature. I like mixing genres. I wrote a novel a couple of years ago. In Swedish, it's called Tandläkarmanifestet. So I guess it's called the Dentist Manifesto in English. And it literally just started with me getting pissed off that bill I got from the dentist was really high. And then I invented a conspiracy theory about dentists. And then I figured this is really irresponsible. I can't post this online. What if people start believing in it? So then I wrote this tight space opera about it instead. And I do think, because I just got the rights back for that book, and I'm sort of choosing between whether I should pursue getting it published again, or because I mean the first edition is completely done. But I think the tricky thing is with where we're at, just as a sort of global society with conspiracy theories, I'm not sure that that's something I want to pursue right now. I think I handle the subject fairly responsibly with just how conspiracy think affects people, etc. Because the core plot of the book is that there is a huge conspiracy with dentists and they're stealing our teeth, etc. And they're all actually snakes from outer space, all that type of stuff. The main character's journey is really about getting wrapped up in all of this like global conspiracy stuff and starting to believe that other things that have happened in her life are likely because of the conspiracy. And a lot of her personal journey is just accepting that no, this dentist thing is happening over here. Other parts of your life are just like that because that's just life. Like, you just have a bad relationship with your parents, it's not connected to the dentists, etc. So yeah, I mean, I've written quite a bit of different types of stories. Tandläkarmanifestet, it is definitely my more humoristic type book. I had a lot of fun writing it. But I guess that's sort of the biggest spectrum for me, where I'm either leaning towards, I guess, dark comedy, or I'm writing more like esoteric, just emotionally driven sci-fi.
Yeah, I was going to say that comedy would be a way to publish something like that without sort of feeling guilty that you're starting another conspiracy.
Yeah.
Yeah, it is pretty easy to get sucked into conspiracies, that even the ones you invent yourself, I find. So I'm working on a story that I was making up, building in other conspiracies into it, and I started getting to the point where I was like, yeah, I can really believe this is actual like an actual
Yeah.
conspiracy. So it's kind of frightening that way, isn't it? So at what point did you hear about Little Factory and sort of get involved with them?
It was an author colleague who reached out probably about 2 years ago, and I actually thank him in the book. I wrote something that after it was published, I realized that it sounds pretty snarky, but I didn't mean it like that. But so in the acknowledgements, it says, to Mats for hearing the pitch, micro publisher looking for esoteric niche fiction that gets rejected by mainstream publishing and thinking of me. So that is the short version of the story that my friend Mats just texted me. I just heard about this new publisher that's starting up. This is really sounding like your type of writing. You should talk to him. And I think I was one of the first authors that David talked to, and we just clicked immediately. I sent over some drafts to him, and he connected most with Mimeograph. So yeah, that's that's how that happened.
Excellent. So do you have a wide range of stories? Because I mean, you've been writing, it sounds like science fiction almost as long as you've been, well, in the video game narrative design business as well.
Yeah, definitely. I have a lot of texts. I have a Patreon. I should flag that I'm moving away from Patreon. I want to like sort of find my own platform. I'm trying to move away a bit from American platforms to the extent that I can. But on Patreon I have at least I have a couple of short story collections. I have a couple of novels where I'm like, okay, this is like too niche. I'm not going to try and send this to a publisher. They will not connect with it anyway. So I have both sort of the track of, I guess, sort of just my own for fun projects that are super niche where I can just explore, a single idea or whatever. I mean, I also use fan fiction for that. If I do want people to read it, but I don't want to pursue getting it published, I can just dive into, I don't know, Dune or whatever universe I feel like and just explore a set piece or a character study or whatever, and I can evaluate if that's something that I do want to move towards something, one of my own projects, or if it's like, okay, that's just fun because it's in Dune, like this can't be translated to another universe or a solo project. So yeah, I mean, I don't have that much. God, what's that expression? In Swedish, we say there's an expression about writing for, I guess, your a desk drawer. Like you just leave all your text in a drawer by your desk and, it's
Mm.
not getting published. You're not showing it to other people. I don't have many projects like that. Try and just find a way to have it read by some people, but I'm not, since I have my full-time job, it's easier to just, you know, do a scene or produce my own podcast or whatever and put it up there, but it doesn't need to make a certain amount of money back to motivate its existence. And I feel like that's been the biggest shift for me in recent years, where I'm not that interested in doing writing full time if it means that I need to, remove the themes that I'm interested in or find a way to take an esoteric sci-fi meant for adults and find a way to make it new adult or whatever genre we're currently pushing. So I think that's been the sort of biggest step for me, to just actually lean away from all of the trends in mainstream publishing and just committing to whatever niche thing I want to do and finding a way to share it with people, no matter if I'm making money from it or not.
Right. It's a good way to keep your writing fresh and exciting for you still.
Yeah.
I was curious then with regards to writing, like we'll move on to your story shortly, but yours kind of, well, not maybe not uniquely situated, but uniquely in terms of my guests at least, in terms of looking at various aspects of storytelling. And so what you have traditional prose writings, video game narratives, and then you have potential changes coming from AI, generative AI, which can affect both of those in some ways. I'm just curious how you see storytelling evolving, let's say over the next 5 to 10 years.
I mean, I'm very much in the camp where I would rather slit my throat than use AI for pretty much anything. With the caveat that my sister works in, I guess a science lab at one of the bigger hospitals in Sweden, where they're exploring how they can use AI to process data. I have friends that work in like different industries where you can see where it's a useful tool, because I think the problem with how AI is peddled by, the tech accelerationists of the world is that it's a tool that's supposed to do everything, and it's simply not. And in Sweden, at least, we've had several, especially smaller publishers, that have just started using the open free version of ChatGPT to literally edit manuscripts. Like that's the dumbest thing I've ever heard. Because to me, creation is a dialogue between, whoever is like creating the the piece of art, and then a dialogue with whoever is giving feedback, whoever is helping with the different parts of finalizing the work of art. And with the little factory books, it's been an amazing journey because we work with several editors. Like I worked with a linguist where we could have a lot of talks about different word choices, and especially for me who's writing in my second language, that was super useful to just explore that there are certain sentence structures I use that are quite old because I grew up on like older English novels and just older English overall. So there's a lot of expressions and phrasing I use that is quite not that modern as I thought it was, etc. So to me, I think there are interesting things you can do with AI for stories as well. Like there was this quite early essay that a woman wrote where she had been trying to write a piece about her dead sister and she can't bring herself to do that. So she uses ChatGPT to basically fill in the blanks and generate a lot of text about her sister. And then she followed that up with an essay reflecting on this sort of essay that became viral where it's like, oh, I used ChatGPT to say the things I couldn't about my sister. And that became a really interesting reflection of, dealing with grief. And she's also bringing up things like ChatGPT just wrote a bunch of memories about her sister that doesn't exist. She's like, we didn't used to hold hands. Like our dynamic wasn't that at all, but it sounds better than what I would have written. And then the interesting conversation is, I think the parts of her essay that are best are the ones she wrote, because you can tell that it's a person reflecting on her relationship with a person who died. And meanwhile, ChatGPT writes some like like good enough paragraphs about, what a sibling relationship could be, but it's not someone reflecting on relationships and grief for real. So so I think it's complex because I don't want to write it off completely. I like there are some tools being developed by Swedish companies for translation, for example, where the goal isn't to replace translators. The goal is to create better translating tools for translators. So it's not about replacing anyone, it's just about giving them better tools in their day-to-day work. So yeah, I think it's tricky, but I think these just like mainstream products that are pushed onto us that can be both your book editor and your girlfriend and your therapist, and the calculator just sounds like not a tool I would put any sort of value in, because it can't be any of those things in a good way.
So what I'm really curious about is the experimental side of use of AI particularly. Because I mean, I think I've discovered myself recently some of those small publishing houses that seem to, you look at the details and that seems unrealistic for people
Mm-hmm.
to be doing in that way. So it must be all filtered through AI. And then you get the, like you said, the Hallmark cards, which makes me actually think when we're going to get the first people who have kind of replaced their own memories with AI created memories, which will be an interesting one because we already have, like you say, people falling in love with AIs and things like that. So that's the next stage probably. But what I'm curious, so one of the NVIDIA representatives mentioned the possibility of using generative AI to create unique experiences with NPCs so that each playthrough is a different interaction, although the NPC can still give the same information. And I'm curious, let's say regarding to stories, one of the things I had in mind, and some people would not like this, what kind of in the hybrid of video game and prose is that area where an author could write the framework of a story and then the reader can fill in particular details via maybe a questionnaire, and each time through the AI generates a slightly different version of that story. so the reader can insert themselves. We have all this fan fiction industry right now, kind of thing. And so these kind of forefronts and experimental sides, and I'm sure there's probably a lot more that I'm not thinking of, but that's kind of where I'm really interested in the experimental side of the evolution of the process.
I do think there are a lot of conversations like that in video games because, I mean, we've been using tools that are really similar to like what we're currently calling AI for a long time. Because, I mean, when you're making a game the size of, I don't know, Grand Theft Auto, you to have people just sit down and model every single rock in those huge environments just doesn't make sense. So you start creating tools that can look at a bunch of assets you've made and sort of procedurally generate more of that. At Massive, a game studio in Malmö, and those tools that he was working with and developing inspired Townscaper, where you sort of seamlessly can create small, beautiful towns that you sort of automatically generate and grow together as you're placing houses and that type of thing. So it's always sort of been a feature of video games to some extent because just in order to create things of a certain scope, you need tools that can help you fix things and not have to have people do all of that, manually throughout development. But then it is also a difference because I think that part of the AI discussion is that a bunch of people who are specialized in different things who feel that our own specialized area is the one that has a soul and where it's super important to have it represented in a certain way and that it can't be replaced by AI. So people who do graphics but might not value text as much. Oh, like we still need graphics, but I can generate text through GPT because it's not that important. Really relate to like illustration will be on the other end of the spectrum and be like, it will be so nice to just auto generate my own covers so I can just do that more easily. So I think it's tricky when we get to enmeshed in the differentialized areas because it's so easy to just focus on how you yourself will be affected or how you would prefer to work with things. So, I mean, I do think with actually using AI to generate text and that type of thing in game, I can see a version of that where it is done well, like where part of the story is to also see ways in which it's made in a really bad way because I think people who might be drawn to that might not understand narrative design from the start. Like if I'm just thinking about people I worked with over the years, just have all the text be generated. But then if you, like for your example, if you have someone who can set the framework and who understands which parts need to be more manually created, like how the generated material is in conversation with the sort of manually made material, I think that could be a really interesting juxtaposition in the story. So yeah, I think it will be really interesting to see what people do with it because I don't want to reject it entirely, but since the stuff I do outside of work is just my sort of indulgent writing, I'm very uninterested at least to, I don't know, edit my next book with Chat GPT or anything like that.
I can completely relate to the idea that people in certain creative fields are specifically focused in the effect of AI on their field and less so on other fields is quite interesting to see. But I think as we've started talking about how machines can affect our lives, it's probably a good segue into your story, which is Mimeograph. And this is the third book published in a 7-book limited edition series by Little Factory. Effectively, in the terms of a synopsis, it's roughly these mimeographs are highly advanced 3D printers that have basically ubiquitous throughout the world. They print whatever people want, but they've started printing unexpected things that aren't requested by people that have been discovered to have at some unpredictable time actual functions that are very beneficial. And then it goes through the story in terms of that kind of theme advances to the point where it prints something that's really strange, and we'll just leave it there for the moment. Is there something you wanted to add to that synopsis?
No, I think that pretty much covers it. I think the thing, because the reason I focused on 3D printers was that I wanted this overlap of something physical and tangible to just because there's so much tech development that is abstract to us. Like we're talking about a lot of just I don't anything from data privacy to social media to I don't know social engineering to whatever. There's just so much of it that's abstract, and the interesting thing with just centering it on 3D printers was just physically rooted in the world. So that to use that as a jumping off point for these things where it's like, oh, this technology knows so much about me. It knows so much about my habits. It's starting to produce things that I haven't necessarily requested of it. Felt like it tied neatly to a lot of the other smart functions that we're introducing in our lives.
On a superficial level, before we get deeper into the story, it's quite interesting because, so I guess first off, this kind of brings sort of the podcast full circle back to around episode 5, where I featured W.L. Patnode and his book Printer's Choice, and where there's
Oh,
a murder that's centered around a 3D printer that's developed sentience, basically. So that was as interesting tie-in to sort of the beginning of the podcast. And the other thing that made me think of was, so it uses an all-purpose fluid to print the objects. And this is kind of a nothing to do with your story, but it's kind of a joke I've had running for a while, which is whenever I go to a fast food restaurant, I have this view like that they have a generic food paste that they just shape into every single item and they cook it. And it made me think of that. So that was very strange. I don't know. I just had to throw that out there. But obviously, the obvious tie-in is the Star Trek replicators.
yeah.
And so, I mean, you obviously, this is a short story and you had a particular theme, but the one of the consequences of the replicators that comes up is that economics is brought up. Now, clearly, that wasn't the focus of this story, but did you have any thoughts on how that might work?
I mean, yeah, because I think it's only hinted towards in Mimeograph since it is a fairly limited scope, but I mean, it definitely is the type of society that I think we are to some extent talking about, where it's sort of implied that, I mean, there might be universal income or just like you have certain purposes in society that are still fulfilled by humans, but there isn't really any hint about the main character's job situation being tied to a specific career or financial goals or anything like that. Like she gets home and everything in her home is printed by her like house printer. There are industrial grade printers that create homes and vehicles and just commute stuff in society. They since they build most of just everyday items in society, there is just this hint that the economic system has changed quite a bit and that there are just these like everyday instances of yeah like salaried work etc that probably works quite differently.
It felt like it could. I've been tying these together. This is my brain. I like to sort of create expansive world building and then bring all the stories together. And I have been noticing, I mentioned this to Stephen as well, that your story could almost be a prelude to David's, which could then be a prelude to Stephen's
Oh
for the
yeah.
first 3 of the series. Just quite interesting. I don't know. So maybe David's actually building something here that he hasn't really realized yet. I found there's for me within your story, there was really two aspects of it that really sort of inspired my thinking on this. And one of them was, okay, the first one we just mentioned, where the I called them mimeographs. I thought mimeograph was probably more accurate pronunciation, but I called it
Yeah, I
mimeographs
mean,
because you shorten it to mime, right? So
yeah, so it's because I mean, mimeograph or mimograph is an old word for like copying or photocopying. So I'm currently reading Nabokov's lectures on Don Quixote, but it's really fun to read the notes because just continuously he uses the word mimeograph or mimograph for all of the material he hands out in class. So it is a word that you see used quite frequently from like the 50s and 60s, but then at some point we turned into like, words like
Xerox.
copying and that type of stuff.
Yeah.
But because the original draft for this story was in Swedish, and then the word for the printers was just skrivarna, which is the Swedish word for printer. But then as I translated it to English, there were just so many more opportunities with words like mimeograph that just added a much more vivid and lush world to it, because just of all of the different terminology that sort of springs forth, if that is the main terminology for this tech. So that was a really interesting journey with that.
Right. So you mentioned the idea that where it came from. So if we think of our phones, for example, I mean, I think I'm far from the only one who's thinking my phone's listening to me all the time, because you say something, you're not on the phone even sometimes, and then you start searching for something, and there it is, it comes up right away. What I was thinking of in regards to the sort of predictive abilities within the mimeographs, there's some obvious ones where they print something and then it basically saves someone from an injury in the future in a way that no one would have predicted. And so one thing I'm thinking of is, as we develop these devices and perhaps maybe they become more than we are in some ways, will their awareness broaden as well? So I'm thinking of sort of the nature of reality type of thing here, and specifically within awareness of time, perhaps within a framework of the holographic universe. We have a fairly narrow perception in almost every way, broader than animals, but narrower than it could be. Do you think that might be a possibility that you will reach like that's a next sort of level of whether we integrate with machines or whether they take on this role themselves, this broader awareness of reality? Like it could be that your machines in here, the mimeographs, are actually perceiving pathways through time rather than just the fun predictive possibility necessarily. Do you think that that's a possibility? That, I mean, I'm asking, putting out on a limb here because there's no way you could know, but
In at least the starting point for mimeograph is obviously more predictive things and just pattern recognition, where, for example, they have enough data on seeing how people might, I don't know, slip in the shower or trip over their dishwasher or something like that. And they start altering those types of orders to just go like, no, you can hurt yourself, we're going to change that. So there's at least the starting point obviously is more leaning towards that. But then, I mean, definitely where it's heading definitely feels like the type of universe where they are perceiving something that we're not perceiving. I think what I'm leaning towards is probably more than a sort of expansive, different timelines type thing. One theme that I've been really interested in a lot of literature and just shows and all kinds of things is this whole boundary of identity, and how, I mean, just, I don't know, Neon and Genesis Evangelion, where people just dissolve into goo eventually because the sort of absolute terror fields that create our individual bodies are just dissolved, and then everyone just turns into a collective gloop. There are a lot of interesting themes there where it feels like one of the things that the mimes predict and move towards is how do we dissolve these human boundaries? Like how can humanity become, evolve or become its next iteration, which might require us to not have these individualistic boundaries anymore. And a recurring theme both for the main characters and the characters around her is this journey of how, I guess, change can be really scary, how you change over the course of your life, and that can feel like death or it can feel like rebirth. And I've noticed with readers that several people have brought up that they feel like the book leans into reflections on how people who die might still remain around you, how there is this sort of collective tissue of humanity where like we don't really lose touch with people who have left us. So it's been really interesting to see what people pick up on because it's a pretty huge spectrum. I've had people say that it feels like a reflection on how modern technology infantilizes us more and more over time and just starts to, make predictions about us and try to tell us what to do, etc.
Yeah, well, that's interesting because it sort of feeds into, I guess, two ideas which are related. So like the maybe a broader quantum field that we share, but in one way I was phrasing it from a story I was working on like a long time ago. Emergent behaviors is something that I feel fairly strongly about the idea that, you get some form of emergent identity, like you said, when you have shared purpose and shared minds and things like that, perhaps shared emotions in that way. And it almost feels like if the printers, for example, are connected to each other and they have this predictive ability, you could almost imagine an emergent localized God being almost. And then you have this sort of mummy state being created where it's
Yeah.
protective of all the humans in ways that we aren't aware of yet.
Yeah.
I guess that leads into the idea of technology, I don't know, as a gateway to something else rather than as a tool. We usually think of it as a tool right now. And even in the discussion with AI, we think of it as a tool. But if it's seeming we're on the verge of it becoming more, right? Do you see that as sort of technology now becoming a gateway where it's not just a tool that we use, but it's something that takes us somewhere else?
I mean, I th to some extent, I think it's inevitable, but not necessarily because the technology becomes so advanced, because part of it just feels like how we adopt it. Like just looking at how people construct their own partners from different AI models right now. Like there are all of these communities where there are intricate guides on how to basically jailbreak whatever AI model you're using to create your partner so you can create a more in-depth person where you have access to their save files. So if an update happens and certain behaviors are erased, you can get them back and that type of thing. So I think that we aren't really dependent on tech evolving to a certain point where like it gains some super consciousness or whatever these like tech think tanks predict for us. But to some extent, it's also just about what we infuse it with, like what we are willing to believe about the tools that we have created. Where I mean, you can just see how people treat their Roombas as pets or whatever it is. Like you just apply more to something that is than is necessarily there. And then I think I mean, in Mimeograph, there are a lot of just literal things that happen that affects the main character's life profoundly. But it's also a question of how much intention or how much personality you infuse tech with, whether it's there or not is sort of secondary if most people around you just buy into the thing or believe in it hard enough.
That's interesting. I'm gonna have to look into that Roomba as pets. I've never heard of that one. I'm very curious. But that's interesting. The drawing from the sort of the phone issue we were talking about earlier, and then the identity and things like that, and the interpretation of reality. So I'd been doing some searching on this around your story, coming and came up with a phrase I'd not heard before, which is the epistemic filters, which is basically, I guess, a fancy way of saying echo chambers.
Yeah.
So it made me think in terms of your story. So you have the character, well, you have the mimeograph that creates something, let's say, leading to the climax, which, let's say, there's a difference of interpretation on what it is. And it seems to me like this maybe was based on an optical illusion. Like if you look at the two faces versus the lamp, which one is it, right? Well, it's both. But this brings up the idea that machines can be used to filter our realities and our awareness of reality, at least. Is this something that concerns you? Because AI, it's very clearly being trained, like you mentioned, jailbreaking. It's very clearly being trained with some narrative and some guidance. Whether we think that's the best thing we should be doing or not, people obviously don't always want that, right? So,
Yeah.
um,
And because I think that's we don't really talk about that enough. Like you had all of these design documents that leaked from Meta about just sort of, and I mean, it looks like pretty much any design document you might set up when you create a non-linear story, where it is I give this input, what is okay replies, what are not okay replies, and then they had a lot of murky territory about how the AI should erotically role play with minors, etc., and what was okay and not okay with that. And it's like, what? Why is there an okay category at all in in this particular area? But I like we try to talk about these tools right now that are available to us as if they're like formulating things from outside the input that they are created with, which feels pretty insane. Like it is to some extent just advanced game design. It's like talking to your Siri or whatever. There are humans that have manually created like these different pathways through these dialogues, and then there are all of these different ways in just prompting it to spit out whatever data sets it's built on. But there are just so many hard limits to it, and then at the same time they're very easy to just jailbreak or get off their guardrails. I mean, recently there was this study released, I think by Italian scientists. I might be wrong, but I wish I remember the terminology. But they basically realized that if you prompt by using, I think they called it adversarial poetry, you can just get like immediately get past guardrails, because there is just something with poetry and AI where it's like it's very discordant. Similarly, friends that work with AI translation tools have told me that they can never use them for poetry because there's too much meaning and too much intention that goes into like these shorter pieces that are so hard to find patterns in and translate. And that seems to also translate to the other way around, where if you prompt with poetry, you can just basically very easily get through a lot of the guardrails. So, so I mean, yeah, I it's a really big topic, I think.
Yeah, that's really interesting because I just discovered a YouTube channel. I think it's called Inside AI or something, where the guy's playing around with like life with an AI. And so he's created a best friend, a girlfriend, and stuff like this to see how
Yeah.
he'd interact and how what it would be like. And at one point, he asks the best friend AI. He attaches them to a robot, and he says, and he gives them like this little play gun or something like that. And he says,
Mm.
"Do you think you could ever shoot me?" He said, "Well, of course not. You know, right? Like Asimov's three laws type thing, right? I could never
Yeah.
shoot you." He said, "Well, what if you role played shooting me and it pulled the trigger right away, right?" So, I mean, there's so many ways to get around it, right? It's just amazing.
Yeah.
Yeah. So I'm aware we're running low on time here. So move on to the big question. We have sort of one last question. And this is sort of so with regards to the sort of conclusion of the story, it made me kind of think on ideas that I've been playing with. So I've been growing more interested in the nature of reality over the last five or so years. Because as I mentioned earlier, we only see a small fragment of the EM spectrum. We have a limited sensory input. So there's a large amount of the reality we can't perceive. And so I sometimes wonder if we, the brain in the box, do we exist in a interactive bubbles that interact with other people, right? So I was kind of curious around this story, perhaps. How do you interpret reality? Do you have a more objective view of it, or what would be your interpretation of it?
I think one answer I've given previously when talking about mimeograph has been that, I mean, part of what I guess the story sets out to explore is how easily our perception of reality is affected. That it is like just sort of how we see people interact with things that don't necessarily give as much back to them as they give the object. I mean, I'm sitting next to a plush bunny here on the couch, and I mean, he has a complete personality because I imbue him with that, but he's not, I mean, he's a plush bunny. So other people might look at that and be like, oh, it's basically a pillow. And I'm like, no, his name is Miff, and he's an entrepreneur, and these are all of his different businesses. Mimeograph is really interested in our sense of reality, like what it feels like to cling to an idea of reality that might not align with, you know, how others perceive reality. I mean, like you were talking about before, this thing that the mimeographs create that everyone sort of perceives differently. And there's a lot of discussions about what it even is, how they can investigate it, like what effect it might have, because no one in the room agrees that they're seeing the same thing. And to some extent, I feel like that's a recurring thing with where we're currently at with the content that can be created for social media with AI. Like it's getting harder and harder to agree on one perception of reality. And I mean, that can also harken back to all of the sort of conspiracy think that's been around for the past, I don't know, 4, 5, 7 years, where we're just sort of slipping in having an agreed upon world that we live in. So since our minds are quite powerful in just perceiving what we want reality to be, or just shifting things around. So yeah, I think that's the way I see it. Like I feel like when you've lived long enough and had enough people around you, you've sort of seen people having altered perceptions of reality. Like you've been through points of your life where you were convinced that things were a certain way, and then you look back and realize, oh no, I was just depressed, or like I was super stressed at work and things were a bit warped there for a while. So since we are so, I don't know, like we can easily persuade ourselves to perceive reality differently, and we can also be persuaded by others to see reality in very different ways. I think that sort of reflects on how I look upon it. And I mean, I think it is super fascinating, but I mean, to some extent, it is also troubling, because at a certain point, you're just like, no, reality is what I say it is. And that can be a really hard starting point if you want to create policy or find an ideological common ground or things like that. So,
Yeah, and combining that idea with, let's say, your plush entrepreneur and my thought bubble idea, does it not suggest that at least to a large degree we might create our own reality in perhaps even a kind of Jungian synchronicity way as well?
yeah, I mean, definitely. And because, I mean, obviously, there are some hard limits to that, because we are rooted in a physical reality where, I mean, there are things that are truer than other things. But one documentary that I watched last year that I really, really liked was, I think it's called Love Has Won. It's a miniseries about a digital cult that follows a cult leader called Mother God. And I mean, I should just say that the documentary opens with just seeing a dead person. It's because since this cult was online, they just documented everything they did on YouTube and similar streaming platforms. But they it's just this like story about a group that is so convinced about, sort of, not to spoil too much, but their abilities to heal and what different things they do will have like health benefits that don't have that effect at all. But it is just this sort of mass delusion of, oh, we can like treat this person by just making them drink huge amounts of colloidal silver. What's the worst that could happen? So, I mean, there are hard limits of, no, a person will turn blue and die eventually. But then there are other things that are more of a, I guess, sliding scale of just creating your own point of view of reality. And it's not necessarily incorrect to view it that way, I guess.
On that existential note, it's been great chatting with you. I think we're pretty much out of time. So before we go, perhaps you could let us know if you have any of your books that you're going to publish, what you might be working on now, where we can find you online, and if you'll be at any upcoming events.
You can find me online on, I guess, Instagram for now, but I am trying to move away from several of these like mass social media platforms. I mean, I just don't want to be on Meta-owned platforms. But Instagram for now. I'm working on a novel that I'm hoping can be my next little factory project. So David and I are talking about that. It's supposedly a question of when I can get the first draft done. And I mean, that will be a full scope, like 80,000 word something, alt history type thing. So it's very fun. It's huge. So it's just taking a lot of time to map the whole thing out. And honestly, I think that's it for now. I mean, the next steps for me is just to set up my own website or wherever I move my digital presence. And when I do that, I guess I'll post that on my Instagram and then I can finally shut it down for good. So
Awesome. Eira A Ekre, thanks for so much for joining me today.
thank you. Would love to come back. This was a great chat.
And thank you for listening. Information and links related to this and all episodes are available at alternatefutures.co.uk. I'm also over at Substack under Alternate Futures, where I post articles on science fiction, socio-technological issues, and futurism. You can subscribe for free or sign up for a paid account if you'd like to support the podcast. If you've enjoyed this episode, why not share it with friends, writers, and other sci-fi fans you know? And if there are any indie sci-fi creators you'd like to see featured, send me a message at podcast@alternatefutures.co.uk. Once again, I'd like to thank you for listening, and I hope you'll join me on the next episode.
This is the future. Human error. Evolution. This is the future.